The kiss was supposed to be a desperate, 3-second shield against humiliation. But when the stranger's massive hand gripped her thick hip, anchoring her in the shadows, Ruby realized two things. The man kissing her back was Boston's deadliest crime lord, and he was never letting go. November 12, 2025. The torrential autumn rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grill 23 and Bar on 161 Berkeley Street sounded like the rattling of dry bones. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of dry-aged Wagyu, white truffles, and a suffocating, expensive dread. The legendary Boston Steakhouse had been closed to the general public for a private, unlisted event. The mahogany-paneled walls and brass-studded leather banquettes usually hosted senators and real estate tycoons. But tonight, the dining room belonged exclusively to the New England Commission. Ruby Croft stood in the narrow alcove between the temperature-controlled wine room and the bustling kitchen, trying discreetly to adjust the hem of her uniform. The standard-issue Grill 23 waitstaff pencil skirt simply had not been designed for a size 18 frame. It gripped her wide hips and thick thighs with an unforgiving, rigid tension, threatening to split at the back seam with every hurried step. She carried her weight beautifully, a lush, substantial hourglass figure that belonged in a classical painting. But in the sterile, high-end hospitality industry, she was treated as an architectural problem. "Stop fidgeting with the fabric, Croft." Kenneth, the floor manager, hissed as he passed by with a stack of linen napkins. He cast a disparaging glance down her robust figure, his upper lip curling into a sneer. "I told corporate it was a mistake putting you on the VIP floor tonight. The uniform is practically screaming for mercy. Just stand behind the oyster bar where your bulk won't disrupt the aesthetic of the room." Ruby's jaw locked. She did not shrink. She did not hunch her shoulders or fold her arms across her stomach the way she used to when she was younger and entirely unprotected. She simply straightened her spine, forcing Kenneth to look up slightly to meet her dark, blazing eyes. "The oysters are prepped, Kenneth, and table 42 needs their cognac." Without waiting for his dismissal, she picked up the silver tray holding a crystal decanter of $3,200 Remy Martin Louis XIII and stepped out onto the main floor. The dining room was a low-lit cavern of hushed, dangerous conversations. Men in bespoke suits with cauliflower ears and dead eyes sat hunched over filet mignons, flanked by bodyguards who did not touch their food. Ruby moved through the labyrinth of tables with a quiet, unapologetic grace, a ghost in black uniform carrying liquid gold. She was halfway to the secluded corner booths when her blood suddenly turned to ice. Sitting at table 38, desperately leaning forward to pitch a leather-bound portfolio to one of the commission's capos, was Brad Hastings. Ruby's breath hitched, her manicured fingers tightening around the edge of the silver tray until her knuckles turned white. Brad, her ex-fiancé, the man who, on April 3, 2024, had drained their joint savings account of $28,500. Money she had broken her back waiting tables to save for nursing school, and vanished. He had left a 2-line note on the kitchen counter of their cramped Somerville apartment, claiming he needed capital for his cryptocurrency startup, and that she was too heavy, physically and emotionally, for a man on the rise to carry. Now, he was sitting 20 feet away, wearing a flashy Tom Ford suit he undoubtedly bought with her stolen tuition money. Beside him, clinging to his arm like a decorative ornament, was a size 2 blonde in a slip dress. Brad was sweating, trying to sell a $14.5 million offshore crypto tumbling service to men who looked like they would sooner cut out his tongue than invest. Ruby desperately pivoted, trying to melt back into the shadows of the mahogany pillars. But it was too late. Brad's frantic eyes darted across the room, searching for a waiter to refill the capo's glass, and locked directly onto her. A slow, vicious smile spread across Brad's face. He excused himself from the table, whispering something to the blonde, and began striding purposefully across the Persian rug toward Ruby. He wanted an audience. He wanted to parade his new success, his new woman, and her failure, right in front of the most powerful men in Boston. Well, Brad's voice slithered over the soft jazz playing through the speakers. He stepped into her path, blocking her escape route to the corner booths. Ruby Croft, still carrying trays, still carrying all that extra weight, I see. I thought by now you'd have given up and moved back to Ohio. Ruby stood her ground, the heavy tray trembling perfectly in time with her heart rate. Walk away, Brad. You don't belong here, and you certainly don't want to cause a scene in front of the people you're trying to rob. Rob? Brad laughed loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. I'm offering them the future, something you know nothing about. Look at you, squeezed into a skirt 2 sizes too small, serving drinks to people who don't even see you as human. You're just a fixture, Ruby, a big sad fixture. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the lapel of her uniform, preparing to flick the fabric in a gesture of ultimate, degrading condescension. The humiliation burned hot and acidic in the back of Ruby's throat. She could feel the eyes of the room shifting toward them. If he made a scene, Kenneth would fire her. If she lost this job, she would be evicted on Friday. She needed to break his line of sight. She needed to become completely unavailable instantly. Driven by a blind, primal instinct for survival, Ruby stepped backward into the heavy shadows of the raised, secluded booth directly behind her. A man was sitting there in complete darkness, nursing a glass of bourbon. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't. Please, Ruby whispered frantically into the shadows, the silver tray rattling as she set it blindly on the edge of the table. Just for 10 seconds. Play along. Before the stranger could speak, Ruby leaned down, grabbed the lapels of his immaculate Italian wool suit, and crashed her lips against his. She expected him to push her away in shock, to shout for security, or to recoil in disgust. Instead, the universe violently tilted on its axis. A massive, calloused hand immediately shot up, burying itself in her thick auburn hair, while an arm, like a steel beam, wrapped around her wide hips. The stranger didn't just play along. He took absolute command. He dragged her forward, pulling her substantial curves directly into his space with zero hesitation. His mouth parted hers with a predatory, scorching heat that tasted of smoke, expensive bourbon, and unapologetic authority. He kissed her like she was the only oxygen left in a burning building. Ruby gasped into his mouth, her knees going weak as his large palm spread wide across her lower back, holding her weight against him as if she were weightless, yet honoring every inch of her solid reality. When the man finally broke the kiss, he didn't let her go. He kept her pinned against his chest, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her jawline. Slowly, he shifted forward into the dim glow of the overhead pendant light. Ruby's breath stopped entirely. It was Dante Cavallo, the undisputed boss of the New England Commission, a man whose name was only spoken in terrified whispers, a phantom who had systematically dismantled the Irish mob 3 years prior and ruled Boston's underworld with cold, surgical brutality. His icy gray eyes were fixed on her, calculating, dangerous, and completely, utterly fascinated. Brad stood 5 feet away, his smug expression melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Dante Cavallo slowly turned his gaze from Ruby to the trembling hedge fund manager. The silence that swept across the restaurant was absolute. The jazz music seemed to fade into nothingness. "Is this the insect you were pitching to me, Leo?" Dante's voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated against Ruby's chest. Across the room, the capo Brad had been talking to practically vaulted out of his chair. His face pale. "Boss, he was brought in by a third party." "I apologize." Dante's hand remained firmly anchored on Ruby's wide hip, a very public, very deliberate physical claim. He looked at Brad, whose knees were visibly shaking. "Get out," Dante commanded softly. The absolute lack of volume in his voice made the order infinitely more terrifying. "All of you, clear the room." The exodus was instantaneous and chaotic. Chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood. The low murmur of wealthy patrons turned into a panicked, frantic scramble for the coat check. Brad Hastings didn't even look back at his blonde date. He practically sprinted for the heavy revolving glass doors on Berkeley Street, leaving his $14.5 million portfolio abandoned on the Persian rug. The capos, the bodyguards, the waitstaff, and even the arrogant manager Kenneth evaporated into the rainy Boston night, terror driving them faster than the freezing wind. Within 90 seconds, the cavernous, opulent dining room of Grill 23 was entirely empty, except for Ruby Dante Cavallo and the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the glass. Ruby finally found her footing, her hands shaking as she pressed against the edge of the leather booth to push herself upright. Her lips were still burning, flushed and swollen from the brutal intensity of his kiss. She expected him to release her, now that the theater was over, to dismiss her as a temporary, bizarre distraction. Dante didn't let go. His hand slid from her hip to her waist, his long fingers splaying comfortably over the thick, soft curve of her stomach. He looked up at her, his icy gray eyes stripping away the drab waitstaff uniform, seeing the bruised, furious woman beneath it. "You're trembling," Dante murmured, his voice shedding the lethal edge it had carried moments before, dropping into a register of quiet, magnetic curiosity. "Why did you kiss me, Ruby?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. He knew her name. I needed him to leave me alone," she stammered, acutely aware of how much space her body was occupying in his immediate perimeter. She tried to take a step back, suddenly hyper-conscious of her size, conditioned by years of Brad's cruelty and Kenneth's sneers. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cavallo. I crossed a line. I'll leave right now." Dante's grip tightened, halting her retreat instantly. He stood up. He was a mountain of a man, towering over her, broad-shouldered, and radiating a terrifying, suffocating power. Yet, as he looked at her, there was a profound, aching loneliness lingering in the depths of his eyes. The hollow exhaustion of a king surrounded by assassins and sycophants, entirely unused to anyone approaching him without an agenda. "You don't shrink for anyone in this room, do you?" Dante said softly, stepping closer until the toes of his hand, polished Oxfords, brushed her sensible, rubber-soled work shoes. "I've been watching you all night. The way you carry yourself. The way you refuse to let that bastard manager make you feel small. You take up exactly the space you were meant to, Ruby. Don't apologize for existing." The sheer, staggering respect in his tone hit Ruby like a physical blow. Nobody had ever spoken about her body like a monument before. Nobody had ever looked at her curves as a manifestation of strength rather than a flaw to be minimized. A hot tear pricked the corner of her eye, but before she could blink it away, the heavy brass doors of the kitchen swung open. The room was supposed to be clear. Ruby saw him in the reflection of the antique mirror mounted behind the bar. It was Garrison, Dante's personal head of security, stepping out of the culinary shadows. But Garrison wasn't holding a radio to secure the perimeter. He was raising a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol, aiming dead center at the back of Dante's head. The silence of the room tore apart. "Dante, move!" Ruby screamed. She didn't think. The same fierce, protective instinct that had driven her to work 90-hour weeks in the ER before her tuition was stolen, overrode every biological urge to flee. She didn't run for cover. She threw her entire body forward, using her substantial weight and mass as a living shield. She slammed both her hands into Dante's chest, shoving the Mafia boss backward with a desperate, roaring strength, just as Garrison pulled the trigger. The suppressed gunshot sounded like a violent cough. The bullet that was meant for the base of Dante Cavallo's skull tore through the mahogany paneling, exactly where he had been standing a millisecond prior. Dante hit the floor hard, pulling Ruby down with him into the narrow space between the leather booths and the heavy oak tables. "Garrison," Dante roared, drawing a sleek Sig Sauer P365 from his shoulder holster in a blur of motion, but he was pinned down. Garrison was advancing rapidly, his boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass of a dropped wine bottle. "Nothing personal, boss," Garrison's voice echoed coldly across the empty restaurant. "But the New York families offered 8 figures for your seat. I'm just cashing out your chips." Ruby was wedged beneath Dante's heavy, muscular frame. She could smell the gunpowder in the air, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline. Dante shifted slightly to return fire, and as he did, Ruby saw the crimson stain rapidly expanding across the left sleeve of his bespoke suit. The bullet hadn't missed completely. It had grazed his bicep, severing a vein. His left arm was shaking, compromising his two-handed grip on the weapon. Garrison was 3 feet away. Rounding the corner of the booth, his gun raised for the execution shot. Dante's angle was blocked by the heavy oak table leg. He couldn't get a clean shot in time. Ruby didn't hesitate. She scrambled out from beneath Dante, ignoring his furious hiss to stay down. As Garrison stepped into the aisle, his eyes entirely focused on the bleeding mob boss, Ruby lunged from his blind spot. She didn't try to be delicate. She didn't try to be a featherweight action hero. She used everything she was, every pound of her size 18 frame, every ounce of strength she had built, hauling patients and carrying heavy trays. She tackled Garrison at waist level, driving her wide shoulder directly into his ribcage like a freight train. The impact was brutal. Garrison let out a sharp gasp of shock as her momentum swept his feet entirely off the floor. They crashed violently into the towering brass and glass seafood station. The structure buckled under their combined weight. Mountains of crushed ice, dozens of oysters, and shattered glass rained down on them. The H&K pistol skittered across the wet hardwood floor. Garrison snarled, a vicious, backhanded strike catching Ruby across the cheekbone, throwing her off him. She hit the floor hard, sliding into the jagged remains of a broken crystal decanter. A massive shard sliced deep into the soft, pale flesh of her forearm, sending a blinding wave of agony up to her shoulder. Garrison scrambled to his knees, lunging toward his dropped weapon. Crack, crack, two deafening, unsuppressed shots from Dante's Sig Sauer tore through the room. Garrison's body jerked violently, then collapsed onto the ice-covered floor, dead before he even realized he had lost the war. The ringing in Ruby's ears was unbearable. She lay on the wet floor, clutching her bleeding arm to her chest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The black fabric of her uniform was soaked in freezing water, and her own warm blood. Heavy, frantic footsteps closed the distance. Dante dropped to his knees in the shattered ice, completely ignoring his own bleeding arm. He didn't look at the dead traitor. His icy gray eyes were entirely fixed on Ruby. Wide with a terrifying raw panic she suspected the boss of the commission had never felt before. Ruby. He breathed her name like a prayer. His massive, blood-stained hands hovered over her, terrified to cause her more pain, before he gently, securely scooped her up. He didn't struggle with her weight. He lifted her effortlessly into his lap, cradling her thick curves against his chest. "I'm okay," she gasped, wincing as he tore a pristine white linen napkin from a nearby table and wrapped it tightly around her bleeding forearm, tying a brutal, efficient tourniquet. "You're shot." "It's a graze," Dante gritted out, his jaw locked in fury as he applied pressure to her wound. He looked down at her face, his thumb gently wiping a smear of Garrison's blood from her cheekbone. The cold, untouchable Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man violently, obsessively claiming the woman in his arms. "You threw yourself at an armed man," Dante whispered, his voice shaking with a dark, furious reverence. His palm flattened against the wide curve of her hip, pulling her closer, honoring the very mass she had just used to save his life. "You brilliant, reckless, magnificent woman. Most men run from me. You stepped in front of the bullet." Ruby looked up into his eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his chest. "You told me not to apologize for the space I take up." A dark, dangerous smile broke across Dante's hardened features. "And you never will again." Before he could lean down to kiss her, the dead radio on Garrison's belt crackled to life in the silence of the restaurant. "Garrison, perimeter is locked. The Maybach in the alley is disabled. We have 10 men at the front doors." Status on Cavallo. Dante's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, lethal calculation. He looked at the heavy revolving doors at the front of the restaurant. where shadows were already moving behind the rain-streaked glass. His secure exit was gone. His armor was gone. Ruby gripped the lapel of his ruined suit, her dark eyes flashing with a desperate, fierce light. "My shift ended 10 minutes ago," Ruby whispered, gritting her teeth against the pain in her arm. "I have a 2012 Honda Civic parked by the dumpsters in the loading dock. It's not a Maybach, but it runs." Dante hauled her to her feet, his arm locked securely around her waist, anchoring her against his side. The king of Boston's underworld, and the waitress who had just saved his life, stood amidst the wreckage. "Lead the way, Ruby," Dante said, raising his gun toward the front doors. "Let's show them exactly what happens when they corner us." Ruby grabbed the abandoned leather portfolio Brad left on the Persian rug, a frantic instinct to reclaim her stolen future before plunging into the kitchen's darkness. Dante followed, his Sig Sauer tracking the shadows. They hit the loading dock. The November rain hammered the pavement. There, parked near a rusted dumpster, sat her faded silver 2012 Honda Civic. 3 men in dark trench coats blocked it. New York hitters. "Keys," Dante murmured, pressing his back against the brick wall. "It has an aftermarket remote start," Ruby whispered, digging the plastic fob from her apron. Brad hated it, said the engine whine was embarrassing, but it misfires on the first crank, triggering the panic alarm. "Do it." Ruby squeezed the button. The Honda's engine coughed violently. A blinding flash of hazard lights erupted, paired with a deafening alarm bouncing off the alleyway. The hitters flinched, raising their rifles toward the blaring noise. It was a 2-second distraction, but Dante Cavallo only needed one. He stepped from the shadows, firing 3 times. Surgical, lethal. The men dropped before the alarm's second cycle. "Drive," Dante commanded. Ruby slid behind the wheel, her injured arm screaming in agony. The Civic's suspension groaned as Dante's massive frame dropped into the passenger seat. She threw the shifter into reverse, tires screaming against the wet asphalt, and rocketed backward onto Stewart Street, vanishing into the chaotic Boston traffic. They didn't go to a Mafia safe house. They went to her cramped 4th-floor walk-up in Somerville. Inside the dimly lit apartment, the adrenaline crashed. Ruby slumped onto her thrifted floral sofa, clutching her bleeding forearm. Dante locked the deadbolt and returned from her bathroom with a first aid kit. He knelt on the faded linoleum before her. He treated her with agonizing reverence. His blood-stained hands were impossibly gentle as he cleaned the jagged cut, applying tight white gauze. "You're ruined," Dante murmured, his eyes dragging over her torn uniform, noting how the restrictive fabric dug brutally into her hips. "This life tried to cage you in a skirt that suffocates you and a world that ignores you." He reached out, his knuckles brushing the soft, wide curve of her thigh. There was no fetishization, only raw worship. "Never again, Ruby. From tonight, you wear silk. You command rooms. You will never apologize for your gravity." Ruby's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. He leaned into her touch, a violent king finding sanctuary in the substantial warmth of her physical body. Then the leather portfolio on the coffee table beeped. Brad's iPad had slipped out. The screen glowed with an active cryptocurrency tumbling sequence. Ruby leaned forward. "Brad didn't just build a crypto tumbler to pitch to you. He's running a live sequence right now." Look at the ledger. Dante's eyes hardened. That's 8 figures moving through shell accounts. Garrison's payout from New York. No, Ruby said, her pulse spiking as she scanned the routing tags. Look at the origin IP address. It's local. The second twist hit Dante like a physical blow. It's Leo, Dante snarled. His own senior capo. Leo used your ex-fiancée's stolen startup to funnel his own assassination payout so he could blame New York. The screen flashed red. Transfer completing in 15 minutes. Destination, Pier 4, Seaport. They're leaving the country, Ruby realized. Not if I kill them first, Dante stated, rising. Bullets won't stop a decentralized blockchain transfer. Ruby countered, her voice hardening. She pulled the iPad onto her thick thighs, her fingers hovering over the glass. But I can. Dante stopped. He looked at the soft, curvy waitress sitting on her sofa, her eyes burning with a brilliant, dangerous intellect. Brad locked this system with a biometric bypass, but he's an arrogant idiot, Ruby said, tapping the screen. He built this infrastructure using the $28,000 he stole from my bank account. He used my laptop's old motherboard to write the foundational code. He never changed the backdoor administrator keys. Dante's icy gray eyes flared with staggering respect. Can you freeze the money? I can do better, Ruby whispered, her fingers flying. I'm routing all $14.5 million directly into the Boston Police Department's pension fund. The moment it hits, the FBI crypto tracking algorithms will flag the origin wallets. Leo and Brad won't just be broke. They'll be federal targets. The tablet chirped. Transfer rerouted. Success, Dante laughed. It was a dark, rich sound that vibrated through the apartment. He pulled her to her feet, his hands gripping her wide waist, crushing her flush against his chest. You are the most beautifully dangerous thing I have ever encountered. Let's go watch them realize it, Ruby replied. They drove to the Seaport district. Pier 4 was desolate, save for a black Gulfstream jet idling on the wet tarmac and a rented Mercedes SUV. Dante and Ruby stepped out into the freezing rain. Leo and Brad were screaming at each other by the open trunk. Brad held his phone, his face pale with terror. It's gone, Leo. The ledger says it went to the cops. I didn't do this. You incompetent worm. Leo roared, drawing his weapon. Drop it, Leo. Dante's voice cut through the rain, cold and absolute. Leo froze. He turned, his gun hand shaking violently, knowing he was trapped between an idling plane he couldn't afford and the wrath of the Commission's king. Dante walked forward, his presence suffocating the space. But it was Ruby who stepped out from behind Dante's broad shoulder. She stood tall in the rain, her ruined uniform clinging to her lush curves, radiating immovable power. Brad stared at her, his jaw dropping. Ruby, how? What did you do? I took back my nursing school tuition, Brad, Ruby said, her voice echoing over the tarmac, plus a heavy interest penalty. Dante kept his gun leveled at Leo. You broke the oath, Leo, and you tried to use an amateur to hide it. That's your final mistake. Dante, wait, Leo pleaded, dropping his gun. 3 black sedans tore onto the tarmac, tires screeching. Dante's loyalists had arrived. They swarmed Leo and Brad, dragging them to their knees on the wet asphalt. Dante lowered his weapon. He turned away from the begging traitors, dismissing their existence. The king of the underworld had reclaimed his throne. but his eyes were entirely focused on his new queen. He walked back to Ruby. The rain slicked his dark hair as he cupped her face in his massive hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. "You saved my life. You destroyed my enemies," Dante murmured, his voice a rough, devoted rasp. He looked down at her thick waist, her wide hips, revering the absolute perfection of the space she occupied. "You are everything they said you couldn't be, Ruby. You are an empire." He kissed her. It wasn't the desperate collision from the restaurant. It was a deep, unyielding promise. He kissed her like she was the foundation of his new world, grounding her body against his, letting the rain wash away the waitress she was, forever making way for the queen she had become. Ruby Croft stopped serving drinks that night. Instead, she took her rightful place beside Dante Cavallo, turning her brilliant mind and immovable grace into the most lethal asset the New England Commission had ever seen. She never shrank again. Did Ruby's brilliant revenge and Dante's fierce devotion leave you breathless? This is only the beginning of their dark, passionate reign. If you loved this thrilling dive into the Boston underworld, hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow Mafia romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel. Ring the notification bell for more intense stories. Stay truly thrilling.